The Istanbul penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Bosphorus, the water separating Europe from Asia, the strait that had connected civilizations for thousands of years. Kyung-ho Choi stood on the terrace with a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, watching the ships pass beneath him, understanding on some level that his position allowed him to see everything but to be seen by almost no one. He was 47, had spent 30 years building himself from nothing into one of the most powerful organized crime figures operating in the Middle East and Central Asia. He controlled operations across Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, parts of Russia. He moved money and goods and people across borders, made decisions that affected the lives of thousands, commanded loyalty from hundreds of people whose only alternative to obedience was death. 2 years earlier, he had married Zara. She was 32, had been born in Los Angeles to a mother from Ivory Coast and a father who had abandoned them before she was born. She had grown up in poverty, had worked her way through college, had become a documentary filmmaker focused on stories about migration and displacement and the invisible people who built the world nobody wanted to acknowledge. She had been in Istanbul filming a documentary about refugee communities when she had met Kyung-ho at a gallery opening. They had talked for 3 hours. He had been charmed by her intelligence, by her passion for her work, by the fact that she was completely unimpressed by his power or his wealth. When he had asked her to dinner, she had declined, explaining that she did not date men whose business interests she did not understand. He had spent the next 6 months ensuring that she understood his business interests. Not the criminal aspects, but the legitimate shell companies, the investment portfolios, the business deals that could be discussed in polite society. He had courted her with the intensity and the focus that he brought to everything in his life. Eventually, she had agreed to marry him. He had believed it was because she had fallen in love with him. What he had not understood was that she had married him believing that she could eventually influence him, that being close to him would allow her to understand his world, and eventually to help him see the consequences of his choices. She had been catastrophically wrong. For 2 years, she had watched him operate. She had attended business meetings disguised as social events. She had listened to him make decisions that harmed people, and she had seen the casual indifference with which he treated that harm. She had realized that her documentary work, her attempts to tell the stories of displaced people, was fundamentally incompatible with being married to someone who had chosen to profit from the very systems that created displacement. She had also realized something else. Kyung-ho did not see her as a partner. He saw her as a possession. He controlled where she went, who she saw, what she worked on. He had insisted that she stop making documentaries because he did not want his wife exposing herself to dangerous refugee camps. He had insisted that she stop seeing her friends because he did not want her discussing his personal life with people outside their marriage. He had insisted that she be present at all his social events and business meetings because he wanted her to understand his world. But what he actually wanted was for her to be visible evidence of his sophistication and his power. She had tried to discuss these control mechanisms with him. I cannot make documentaries. I have a degree in film. I have been recognized for my work. This is my profession, my passion. Your passion is being my wife. Your profession is supporting my reputation and my business interests. You do not need external validation when you have me. I need to work. I need to have something that is mine, that I have built, that is not dependent on your approval. Everything you have is dependent on my approval. Your apartment, your clothing, your ability to travel, your security. This is what marriage is. You have aligned your interests with mine. That is not what marriage is. Marriage is partnership. What you are describing is ownership. I own you because I love you. I protect you because I love you. You are safe because I control every aspect of your environment. That is love. She had realized then that he was not going to change, that his inability to see the difference between protection and control, between love and possession, was fundamental to who he was. That she could either spend the rest of her life trying to convince him that she was a separate person with her own needs and autonomy, or she could leave. She had begun to plan her departure 18 months into the marriage. The planning had to be careful and covert. Kyung-ho had security personnel who monitored her movements. He had access to her phone records and her email. He had made clear that if she ever tried to leave him, the consequences would be severe. Not necessarily for her physically, but for everyone she cared about. "If you ever betray me," he had said casually one evening, "if you ever try to leave or to expose my business interests, I will destroy everyone you love. Your mother, your friends, anyone who means anything to you will face consequences. Do you understand?" She had understood. So she had been patient. She had learned the patterns of his security detail. She had identified the times when his attention was focused elsewhere. She had slowly accumulated resources, a bank account he did not know about, documents proving her identity, enough money to disappear. And she had waited for the right moment. That moment came the night of Kyung-ho's birthday party, a lavish celebration at their penthouse with 50 of his closest associates and business partners. He was feeling powerful, feeling victorious about a recent business acquisition, feeling absolutely certain of his control over his life and his wife. At one point during the party, he had made a joke to several of his lieutenants. "My wife will never betray me. She knows the consequences. She understands that she belongs to me, and she is content with that understanding. Other men lose their wives because they do not establish proper boundaries. But I have established very clear boundaries, and my wife respects them absolutely." The men had laughed. Someone had raised a glass to his command over his household. Zara, standing nearby with a glass of champagne, had smiled and played her role perfectly. Inside, something had shifted. She had realized that staying, even for one more day, even for one more hour, was a choice to accept this assessment of her life. That by remaining, she was confirming his belief that she was content to be his possession, that she accepted his narrative about their marriage, that she was incapable of autonomous choice. She had finished her champagne. She had excused herself to the bedroom. And she had begun to pack. The suitcase was elegant leather, expensive, one that Kyung-ho had given her for their first anniversary. It held almost nothing. She could not take much without alerting his security detail. Clothes, documents, the money she had hidden in various locations throughout the penthouse, her mother's address in Los Angeles. It held her entire plan to become someone other than Kyung-ho's wife. She packed quietly, crying silently, understanding that she was burning down her entire life, but unable to see any alternative. She packed until the suitcase would hold no more, and then she sat on the bed and waited for morning. The penthouse was quiet by 3 in the morning. Kyung-ho had gone to sleep, satisfied with his party, satisfied with his control, satisfied with his absolute certainty that his wife would never leave him. At 4:30 in the morning, when the security detail was changing shifts, when there was a brief window of inattention, Zara picked up her suitcase and walked out of the penthouse. She did not say goodbye. She did not leave a note. She simply took the elevator to the ground floor, walked past the security personnel who knew her face and who had been instructed not to stop her, and disappeared into the Istanbul morning. She took a taxi to the airport. She used her real name on a flight to London, knowing that Kyung-ho would figure out her route within hours and that she needed to create distance before that realization had consequence. From London, she caught a flight to Los Angeles. From Los Angeles, she disappeared into the parts of the city where people did not have fixed addresses, where she could move between friends' couches and short-term rentals, where someone with resources could find her but would have to work harder than Kyung-ho was willing to work. She deleted all social media. She changed her phone number. She told her mother to expect harassment and to refuse all contact. She became a ghost of the woman she had been. When Kyung-ho woke up the next morning, he found the bedroom empty. He found the elegant leather suitcase gone. He found the wedding photograph that had sat on the bedside table left face down. For a moment, he did not understand what had happened. Then understanding crashed into him like physical force. His wife had left him. His wife, who had been under his absolute control, who had been isolated from her friends and her work, who had been told repeatedly that she belonged to him and that attempting to leave would result in consequences for everyone she loved, had somehow managed to leave. He had immediately mobilized every resource at his disposal. He had contacted his security detail, had demanded to know where she had gone, had discovered that she had simply walked out of the building during a shift change, and had disappeared. He had investigators tracking her movements. She had taken a flight to London using her real name. From London, she had caught a flight to Los Angeles. And from Los Angeles, she had vanished. He had spent 6 months trying to find her. He had searched using connections across multiple countries. He had offered money to people who might have information. He had essentially put significant resources into locating one woman who did not want to be found. It had been futile. Zara had made her disappearance absolute. She had severed every connection that might have allowed him to trace her. She had built a completely new life in a different city, under circumstances that made her essentially invisible to someone trying to locate her from a position of power. What Kyung-ho eventually realized, after months of futile searching, after accepting that she was truly gone, after understanding that his absolute certainty about controlling her had been catastrophically wrong, was that he had created the conditions that made her departure inevitable. He had isolated her from her support network. He had stripped her of autonomy. He had made clear that attempting to leave would have consequences. And in doing all of this, he had demonstrated that she could not trust him, that she could not build a life with him, that her only option was to leave in a way that did not allow him to stop her. The woman who had once been passionate about telling the stories of displaced people had become one of those displaced people herself. Invisible, moving between places, surviving on limited resources, existing in the margins of society, where Kyung-ho's power was significantly diminished. Years later, Zara would tell the story of her marriage and her departure in an interview with a journalist. He believed he was protecting me. He believed that controlling every aspect of my life was an expression of love. He believed that my contentment was measured by my obedience. And he believed that I would never be capable of leaving because the consequences he had threatened would deter me. Why did you leave? Because I realized that staying was slow suicide. That every day I remained in that situation, I was accepting his assessment of me as his possession. That I could either spend the rest of my life trying to convince him that I was a separate person with autonomy and rights, or I could leave and spend the rest of my life rebuilding from nothing. I chose leaving. Did you love him? I loved the person I thought he could become. I loved the potential I saw in him. But I did not love the man he actually was. And eventually, I understood that love was not sufficient justification for staying in a situation that was fundamentally damaging to my sense of self. Do you regret marrying him? I regret the time I spent trying to change him instead of leaving earlier. I regret the years I spent accepting his control as protection. But I do not regret marrying him, because the experience taught me what I was capable of surviving, and it taught me the difference between love and control. Kyung-ho, years later, would speak about his marriage in very different terms. He had continued to operate his criminal enterprise. He had taken a new wife, a woman from a traditional background, someone who did not question his authority, someone who was content with the boundaries he established. But he had never forgotten Zara. He had never stopped thinking about the morning he woke up to find her gone. He had never fully processed what her departure represented. Not a betrayal, but a boundary. Not a weakness on her part, but a refusal to accept his narrative about their relationship. On the rare occasions when he discussed her with someone he trusted, he would acknowledge a truth he had spent years trying to avoid. I destroyed my marriage not because my wife was unfaithful or because she did not love me, but because I did not understand that love requires respecting the autonomy of another person. I believed that controlling her was the same as caring for her. I did not understand the difference until she was gone. 10 years after Zara left, Kyung-ho would read a profile of a documentary filmmaker who had won international recognition for her work on displacement and migration. The filmmaker was identified as Zara Mitchell, her married name from a brief marriage to an Australian journalist that had ended amicably 2 years earlier. Her documentaries focused on stories of women escaping violent relationships, stories of people rebuilding lives in countries that were not their origin, stories of survival and autonomy and the resilience required to choose oneself over the comfort of being someone's possession. He understood, finally, that by trying to keep her, by trying to control her, he had pushed her toward the very thing he had most feared, her complete departure from his life. The woman who had once been his wife had become a voice for thousands of women whose stories would never be told unless someone like her was willing to tell them. She had taken the trauma of her marriage and had transformed it into purpose, into work that had meaning beyond herself. And Kyung-ho, standing in his penthouse overlooking the Bosphorus, understanding that she had chosen to disappear rather than to remain with him, finally grasped what should have been obvious from the beginning. He had never owned her. She had always been her own person. She had chosen to marry him, and she had chosen to leave him. Both choices had been hers, not his. The only thing his control had accomplished was to remove him from her life entirely. The suitcase she had packed on the night of his birthday party had held more than her belongings. It had held her entire future. A future that did not include him, a future that he had made inevitable by failing to understand the difference between love and possession, between protection and control, between building a life with someone and imprisoning them within the life you had built. Years after her departure, in an interview about her work, Zara would be asked what she wanted people to understand about her documentaries. "I want people to understand that control is not love. That isolation is not protection. That when someone tells you they are leaving, they are not betraying you. They are choosing themselves, and that choice should be respected even if it results in losing the person you thought you loved." She paused, and the interviewer could see something shift in her expression, the moment when she was thinking about her own departure, her own choice to leave. "The hardest part of leaving was understanding that it was not his betrayal that made me stay away. It was my own refusal to accept that I was worth more than the role he had assigned me. Once I understood that, I could not return. Even if he had changed, even if he had understood what he had done, I could not return because I had learned that I was capable of building a life that was entirely my own."